Okay, let's jump into this deep dive. We're looking at the state of democracy in East Africa today.
Right, and we're basing this on an opinion piece from Al Jazeera.
Exactly. So the mission here is to really understand the alarming trends the article describes,
And explore the reasons it gives for this retreat, as it calls it.
and maybe look at the solutions it proposes, but strictly based on this one source.
Got it. And the piece, it really starts with a punch, some quite disturbing recent events.
Yeah, it does. It gets right into it with the story of Gather Atair, a Ugandan lawyer, and Boniface Mwangi, the Kenyan activist.
Their detention in Tanzania.
Right. Atair held for 5 days. They just dumped at the Matukula border, Uganda, Tanzania.
And Mwangi dumped at the Kenya-Tanzania border a day earlier. The article mentions he showed signs of physical abuse.
And there were allegations of torture, too, from Atair's organization and from Mwangi himself about her treatment. It's pretty chilling stuff.
It really is. And the article uses this straight away, saying these incidents are a painful reminder of just how far democracy in the region has retreated.
And it gives context, right? They were there showing solidarity with Tundu Lissu.
Yeah, the Tanzanian opposition leader, he's facing charges, including treason.
Okay, so these specific cases, the article frames them as symptoms of a bigger problem, a broader pattern across the region.
Exactly. It uses them as a jumping-off point to talk about wider pushback against opposition and activism.
So beyond Lissu in Tanzania, what other examples does the article bring up?
Well, it mentions Kizza Besigye in Uganda, another major opposition figure.
Facing similar charges?
The same treason charges, yeah. The piece kind of suggests that the logic being applied is, well, simply organizing opposition is being treated as treasonous.
Wow. That fundamentally challenges the whole idea of democratic opposition, doesn't it?
It really does, treating dissent as disloyalty.
What about Kenya? The article mentions the situation there, especially after those anti-finance bill protests in 2024.
Yes, it points to Kenya as another example. It suggests the official opposition has been weakened by frenetic deal-making and horse trading, is the phrase used.
So who stepped into that vacuum, according to the source?
The youth activists and protesters, essentially. They became the sort of unofficial opposition during that movement.
And the article says they face serious consequences.
It does. It states there were at least 82 deaths during the protests.
32?
Yeah. And that was followed by a spike in kidnappings and abductions of protesters.
And are people still missing?
Well, the article says activist groups allege some people are still unaccounted for, despite, official statements saying otherwise.
That's incredibly serious. Does the source touch on other countries briefly?
It does, briefly. Mentions Burundi people living under the shadow of police excesses, fear of war. In Rwanda, it says opposition figures trying to run against President Kagame ended up jailed.
Okay.
And the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, is described as just perpetually caught between war and political crisis.
So it's painting this picture of shrinking civic space, less room for opposition, more danger for activists across several East African nations.
That's the clear message, yes.
Which brings us to the big question the article tackles. Why? What's the core explanation it offers for this democratic retreat?
Well, the article puts forward what it calls the simplest answer, and it's quite pointed.
Okay.
It argues that people, perhaps citizens and the international community alike, kind of allowed themselves to conflate just having elections with having democracy.
See elections as the be-all and end-all, maybe.
Exactly. And the source suggests that those in power, acting with what it terms malicious intentions, took advantage of this narrow focus.
That's quite a critique.
Yeah.
So the focus on just the vote missed the deeper structures needed.
That's the argument. It says building real, robust democratic systems is way more complicated than just ticking a box every few years. It requires, and this is a key phrase, round-the-clock vigilance.
Round-the-clock vigilance. Okay, so what are the specific components of a meaningful democracy that the article says are necessary but have been eroding or retreating?
It points to three main things that have been weakened over the last couple of decades.
Okay.
Robust local government, transparent political parties, and institutional accountability and participation.
Right. Local government, party transparency, institutional checks. If those are weakening, where does the power end up, according to the article?
Highly centralized, it argues power remains concentrated in the executive branch.
And how is that maintained? What enables that concentration?
Crucially, the article blames the capitulation of legislatures.
Capitulation, that's a strong word. How does it describe that happening? What does that look like?
It talks about a common dynamic, this Nyumba Serikali approach.
Which means?
I am requesting of the government. Basically, the source argues that parliaments, even though they're elected by the people, just repeatedly submit to what the executive wants.
So the legislative branch isn't acting as a proper check on power.
That's the core argument.
Yeah.
They have the popular mandate, but they defer.
Does it offer a concrete example of how this weakness plays out? Maybe even before someone gets elected.
Yes, it uses the experience of women trying to enter politics as a kind of case study.
Okay, how so?
It draws on research, mentioning a volume about the 2017 Kenyan election, saying the problem often starts right inside the political parties.
Inside the parties.
Yeah. Candidates apparently have to, quote, kowtow to a kingpin within the party just to get the nod, just to be allowed on the ballot paper.
Kowtow to a kingpin. That really paints a picture of internal party dynamics, doesn't it? About loyalty upwards, not necessarily outwards to voters.
Precisely. And the article claims that those who don't play that game, who don't show that deference, are often just locked out. They don't get the chance to run.
And the result of that?
Well, the source says that outside of places with specific constitutional quotas for women, women's actual participation in electoral politics has gone down.
Inclined.
Yeah, and it calls this decline a canary in the coal mine of shrinking democratic space. A warning sign.
That's a potent metaphor.
Huh.
And are the parties aware of how this looks, this potential decline in women's participation?
Your article suggests they are, yes. It says parties have become adept at managing gender optics.
Gender optics, like making it look good.
Exactly. Performing support for women, but without making real structural changes. It argues this kind of reduces the whole debate about democracy down to just the periodic ritual of voting again.
So the article's arguing that even when we see women reach high office, we should maybe question if it represents genuine democratic progress.
It prompts that question, yeah. It uses Samia Suluhu's presidency in Tanzania as an example.
How does it frame that?
It suggests viewing it less as inherent democratic progress and perhaps more as the ruling party strategically managing the country by selecting her. And similarly with Rwanda, where women dominate parliament numerically, the article questions whether that's real progress for women's power or if it reflects the ruling party selecting candidates expected to be compliant.
Okay, so if this weakness starts in the parties, and candidates have to please these kingpins, and even elected legislators end up deferring to the executive, what does the article say about the elections themselves? Do they still matter?
The article argues that these mechanisms lead to elections where the actual impact diminishes rapidly over time.
So they become more performative than impactful.
That seems to be the implication. Less about voters genuinely shifting power, more about legitimizing the existing structure.
And how does the source illustrate the control that's maintained after these performative elections?
It gives a couple of specific country examples. In Uganda, it mentions politicians being, quote, bought off with state cars and loans.
Okay, so co-option.
Right. And in Tanzania, it talks about critics being silenced through arrests, detentions, and disappearances.
So a mix of carrot and stick, essentially, to
Yeah.
keep the system in line.
That's the picture painted, yes. Co-option and suppression.
It's striking how the article connects these dots. The party structures, the weak legislatures, the suppression tactics to argue the whole electoral process loses significance.
It does make that connection very strongly. And it adds a brief point. This isn't entirely unique to East Africa.
Oh, it mentions parallels elsewhere.
Briefly, yeah. It references things like the Tea Party movement in the U.S. or careerist politicians being a problem globally.
But there's something specific to the region.
It highlights what it calls an extra layer of risk in East Africa.
And what is that extra risk?
The source points to the unquestioning and blind loyalty of security services, to the whims of the state. It even draws a parallel to something it claims the current U.S. administration is trying to build into IC, interestingly.
Okay. So the role of the security forces adds another dimension of risk.
That's the argument. Unchecked loyalty to the executive, basically.
All right, so the article paints a fairly bleak picture of the problem and its causes. Let's shift focus. What about solutions? How does the source suggest democracy can be salvaged or rebuilt in East Africa?
This is where the article really pivots towards a long-term vision. It argues the solution lies with ordinary people.
How so?
By becoming more engaged in localized democratic practices.
Localized, you mean like neighborhood level stuff, not just national politics?
Exactly that. The central idea is that this kind of grassroots engagement can actually change the quality of people who rise up the ranks in politics over time.
So changing who gets into power by changing how democracy works at the very local level.
That's the theory. The article acknowledges it's hard, when people are just focused on survival day to day.
Sure, basic needs come first.
Right. But it frames this local engagement as creating new entry points for civic engagement, even within those tough circumstances.
Okay, so where does this localized democracy actually happen, according to the article? What kind of institutions are we talking about?
It suggests democracy gets stronger when people actively participate in governing the civic institutions that directly impact their lives.
Like what? Give me some examples.
Things like schools, maybe parent associations, hospitals, trade unions, cooperatives, even neighborhood associations, sports clubs, social clubs.
Okay. So the places where people interact and decisions affect their immediate quality of life, as the article puts it.
Precisely. That's the connection it makes. If democracy is practiced in these everyday spaces,
Then what happens to the big national elections?
then, the article argues, elections become the culmination of 4 or 5 years of regular exercises of democracy. They're not just this separate event floating out there, disconnected from daily life.
That's a really different way of thinking about elections, not the start, but the result of ongoing democratic practice.
Exactly. A reflection of grassroots democracy rather than a substitute for it.
What about the role of the legislators themselves in this vision? Does the article have anything to say to them?
Oh, absolutely. It puts the responsibilities squarely on legislators to, quote, find their teeth and their purpose.
Find their teeth, meaning stand up to the executive.
Yes. The article is explicit. Their job is not about political survival or career advancement.
What is their job then, according to this source?
To defend the people who elected them, to rein in the excesses of the executive, and to defend the integrity of the Constitution.
Defend the people, rein in the executive, defend the Constitution. Pretty clear mandates.
Very clear. It's a call for them to remember who they're supposed to serve.
And how does the article wrap up this call to action, particularly for citizens?
It ends with a powerful quote, urging we, the people, to heed the words of the late Nigerian public intellectual Tajuddin Abdul-Rahim.
And those words are,
Don't agonize, organize.
don't just worry about it, do something about it.
Exactly. The ultimate goal presented is to rebuild democracy in East Africa from the ground up.
So to recap this deep dive into the Al Jazeera piece, it really flags this critical issue, the danger of equating elections alone with democracy. The article argues this has allowed democratic space to shrink in East Africa.
Right. It points fingers at centralized executive power, enabled by legislatures that it says have capitulated, becoming beholden to party kingpins instead of voters.
And these factors, the article contends, weaken the real impact of elections and open the door for repression and co-option.
But it doesn't just leave it there. It proposes this long-term solution focusing on rebuilding democracy from the bottom up.
Through ordinary people getting involved in governing their local institutions, schools, hospitals, community groups, unions.
Making those national elections eventually become the genuine outcome of continuous, everyday civic engagement, and demanding that legislators fulfill their true role as defenders of the people and the Constitution.
It's a compelling argument, definitely. And that final call to action, don't agonize, organize, aiming to rebuild democracy from the ground up.
It certainly leaves you, the listener, with something substantial to think about.
Absolutely. Consider that core idea from the article. Maybe truly strengthening democracy isn't just about those big national votes every few years.
Maybe it's more about how actively involved you are in the governance of the things closest to you.
Your kid's school board, your local clinic's advisory group, your neighborhood association, maybe even a local co-op or union branch.
What does that idea of organizing from the ground up actually look like, practically speaking, right where you live? Whether that's in East Africa or anywhere else in the world for that matter, something to mull over.